Hello, I'm Eric Matisik, co-chair of Denver Startup Week. Last year, we were able to bring the global audience together for Denver Startup Week, and this year, we're excited to welcome that global audience back as we celebrate and showcase the best of entrepreneurship that the Denver ecosystem in Colorado has to offer. In Denver and beyond, there are lots to explore this week, but most importantly, we're excited that you're joining us. We have nearly 50 sponsor companies who contribute to make Denver Startup Week possible. Let's show our love for these companies today and all week long. Thanks to our headquarters and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors whose leadership makes this week come to life, Capital One Cafe, the Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork, and our track sponsors who've made all the great content you're hearing today possible, which includes our founder track sponsor, Kickstart, our growth track sponsor, Friday Health Plans, developer track sponsor, Quizlet, product track sponsor, Palantir, design track sponsor, Battery 621 and the Public Works, people track sponsor, Exactly, and the spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing this excitement to the entire week. Thank you to B-Side Fund, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing Company, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, Gusto, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pi Insurance, Promontory Mortgage Path, Red Bull Basement, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and the VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our sponsors and member sponsors who are listed on the screen, and thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. Now, let's get to it.
WeWork is powering the future of hybrid work, giving companies whatever workplace they need, where and when they need it. With no traditional long-term lease, you have the flexibility to upsize, right-size, or transfer your commitment to another location. From private offices to full floors, create a workplace that meets all your team's requirements. For remote employees, access to hundreds of our convenient locations empowers them to do their best work anywhere. It's hybrid, designed by you, powered by WeWork.
Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on the new builders. I'm Seth Levine. I'm going to play host and MC. Kwame Spearman, who I'm going to have introduce himself in just a moment. We've got a nice group here at the Denver Pavilion, and we've got a bunch of people apparently online. I'm glad we've got this kind of hybrid thing going. So I'm not quite sure where to look. The audience is over here, the camera's there, Kwame's here. So sorry if I'm not looking at you directly if you're listening online, but we got a lot to talk about today. So by day job, I am a venture capitalist. I'm one of the co-founders of a firm called Founder Group that's up in Boulder, Colorado. We manage about $3 billion. We invest in technology businesses, and we invest in other venture funds. But much more importantly for life, frankly, and for this conversation, I'm also the co-author of a book called The New Builders, Face to Face with the True Future of Business. And it really talks about sort of the evolving nature of business and frankly, the ways in which technology and tech entrepreneurship has kind of perniciously overtaken our view of what entrepreneurship means. And so there's a lot to dig into here. I'm going to ask Kwame, who's an example of a new builder and is as the CEO of the Tattered cover, to introduce himself. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key themes I think we're going to talk about, and we'll kind of use your story to punctuate some of those themes, and we'll just go back and forth on it. So let's start with just a quick intro. I know you've got an interesting background. I know you well. So
totally. And I similarly have no idea where I'm looking. And so for the folks online in particular, I feel you on that.
Just look at each other and just have a private conversation. There's no one out there.
Yeah, there's no one out there. So my name's Kwame Spearman, and I wanted to say Foundry isn't just some VC, right? It is easily Colorado's most preeminent VC, and I think a lot of the reasons why we've seen such a surge in companies and awareness and tech in this state is due to your organization. So I just wanted, Seth is incredibly humble, but for those who aren't aware, although I'm sure everyone who's watching is aware. So my name's Kwame Spearman. I grew up here in Denver. I actually remember when the Pavilions, which is where we're filming, opened. It was this very interesting thing because I think I was like 12 or something. And so this was a place that you could be away from your parents. And so I spent a lot of time here, and haven't since then. Anyway, so I grew up in Denver, East High grad, which I always sort of wear on my shoulder before heading to the Northeast for about 20 years. And I recently came back in January. And as Seth mentioned, along with someone who I knew from speech and debate in high school, we purchased the Tattered cover bookstores. We currently have 6, soon to have 7 around the Denver metro area. And Tattered cover we've been around for about 50 years. We like to think of ourselves as a beloved institution, but, and we're going to talk about this a lot, like many beloved institutions that have been around for a long time, the business was at the brink of bankruptcy when we acquired it. And so one of the things, the main thing we're trying to do is create something that's not just around, but sustainable and profitable moving forward. But we've got a lot to talk about. So that's my quick intro.
Absolutely. I mean, really, in some respects, the whole session is about how important small business really is. And that's not to take anything away from big business and not to take anything away from tech entrepreneurship. But, when we, just to sort of frame maybe some of the things that we talk about in the book, there are a handful of key themes and they'll relate to what we're going to talk about for the rest of this session. But I think they're really important. And in particular, they're important for this audience because I think that there are some things that are taking shape in entrepreneurship writ large that most people in technology don't understand. The first of which is that entrepreneurship's in a profound state of decline, which is probably shocking. Certainly everyone that I mentioned that to, and that my co-author Elizabeth McBride mentioned that too, as we were sort of doing our research, was shocked by that. Frankly, I was shocked by that when we started our research a couple of years ago. Is not what I expected to find. But the truth is that entrepreneurship is declining. Now, that's not true in the technology sector, right? Where the world is on fire at the moment, at least in the tech world. But it is true writ large. Now, there are some signs of hope during COVID. Interestingly, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why, new business applications for new business licenses, were significantly higher. So maybe that's not uncommon, right? We did see a little blip during the Great Recession, then it fell back down. That was 2008, 2009. So maybe this one will be more sustained. But I think that's really surprising, and I think it's something that people need to understand in the world of technology. Related to that is this I described it earlier as this sort of pernicious encapsulation of entrepreneurship as technology entrepreneurship. There's a really interesting history to that relates to Ronald Reagan and the Cold War. And basically Reagan, who of course was the governor of California, used entrepreneurship and narrowed the definition of entrepreneurship to mean technology businesses, technology startups. He used it as a form of diplomacy. And he talked a lot about the entrepreneurs of America, meaning the tech entrepreneurs of America. And he used that to differentiate between the US and communist Russia at the time. And so we've been on it. That was sort of in the 1980s. So we're sort of in this 40-year sort of slide into describing entrepreneurship in a more narrow way, which I think we think, Elizabeth and I think is wrong. And I think it contributes to some of the narrowing of our support of a broader set of entrepreneurs. 100 years ago, the farrier, the corner store, someone running an apothecary, those were all considered entrepreneurs. We need to take that word back, right? There is great energy, there's great motion taking place across all sorts of different types of businesses. Many are found on main streets. Some are found in office parks. Some are found in spare bedrooms, all run by entrepreneurs, many of whom don't think of themselves as entrepreneurs. Many of the new builders that we interviewed in the course of researching the book didn't think of themselves as entrepreneurs, which is amazing because these were some of the most entrepreneurial people I've ever met, right? One of the women we talk about started a business with $37 in food stamps. I mean, literally started a business. It's now a thriving bakery in Lawrence, Massachusetts. She employs 16 people. That's very entrepreneurial in a way that describes, to me, entrepreneurship at its core. Related to that is this sort of Silicon Valley obsession with scale. And I think we've lost touch with the power and the benefit of smaller businesses, Main Street businesses. And I think that those two things in particular are things I hope this group understands and thinks about, because I think we, and I would very much include myself in this, contribute to that in the way that we talk about entrepreneurs, in the way we talk about scale, in the way that we are obsessed with unicorns. Makisha Booth this morning, Keisha and I did a session, so a sort of a similar topic. And she described the businesses that we really need aren't unicorns, which are mythical and sort of don't really exist. But the businesses we need are like bees. We're interconnected. They work together. They're part of a community. I love that description. I had been using camel, which is way less cool.
Not as
Not
cool.
as cool. So now I'm going to use bees. And of course, I love Keisha, so I'm glad that she lent that to me. And then lastly, and we started describing this, the types of people that are starting businesses today are different, right? I think many people, especially people in the technology world, think of the typical startup founder as someone who's likely to be white and male, and that's just simply not true. The fastest growing segment of new entrepreneurs, new business owners are women. The fastest growing group within women are Black women, right? Black women are the single fastest growing group of new business owners. And more generally, people of color are starting businesses at a significantly higher rate than white people. And white men are now actually the minority of business owners. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't understand. Related to that, we don't do a really good job of supporting those people. And we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the session, but that perhaps is one of the reasons that entrepreneurship in the United States is declining. So with that as the backdrop, and with you as a new builder sitting next to me, talk a little bit about kind of your entrepreneurial journey, right? I mean, it's an important backdrop to how you got to be the CEO of a large independent bookseller.
Totally. It's really funny because I spoke yesterday, and my rallying cry that I think particularly for this week is the areas that need innovation the most are the areas that are most overlooked. And my push is for there to be a new generation of founders and builders and innovators who go after brick and mortar or other areas that we need more bees. And I actually credit a lot of it to your book, because I didn't view myself as an entrepreneur 9 months ago. I viewed myself as someone who's sort of classically on your high growth, searching for a unicorn trajectory. I did a JD MBA. I worked at Bain for consulting. And before Tattered Cover, I was at a company called Notel. And we were essentially like a smaller WeWork. So imagine all of the stories you've heard about WeWork. We were like a tenth of that. And I got there very early. And, what was so fascinating about that is companies like Notel, companies like WeWork, they really put a lot of emphasis on purpose, right? And what I've realized is that if you really want purpose, do something purposeful, right? And it's not to diminish the notion that, co-working and shared space is not an incredibly valuable element of our society. But I juxtapose that with literacy, right? And I think about what happens when children, particularly those who wouldn't normally have access to literature, start reading, right? And how that can fundamentally change their lives. To me, that's more purposeful. But to get to sort of the answer to Seth's question, my journey was sort of happenstance. I dealt with, I think, the same thing that everyone else was dealing with in COVID, where I looked back during the past, let's call it 10 years of my life, and I sort of asked what I was doing, right? And I asked if I was going to be, I don't have any children, but I sort of asked myself, like, am I on a path where I'm going to be doing things that I'm going to be happy to tell my kids about, right? And unfortunately, the answer was no. And I was doing fine financially. I was doing great socially. And I realized in that moment, George Floyd was murdered, literally our country, world was on fire. I just had a tremendous amount of privilege, right? And I started thinking what that meant and if I was comfortable with that and what I wanted to do. And what was so interesting about Tattered Cover is, so the business has been in financial duress for quite some time, right? Really since the advent of like Barnes and Noble and then everything that's happened with Amazon. And so when we were evaluating the opportunity, the business was basically headed towards insolvency, right? And so we knew that we needed to raise money, right? So step one on being an entrepreneur, like raising money, we essentially had to come up with a business plan. And what I found is that I was actually using the toolkit that if I wanted to write a deck to go to Foundry to try to get seed money for the next unicorn, it was the exact same logic, right? We came up with a theory, right? Which is traditional retail is dead unless you can do two things. You've got to have experiential, so people have to want to go into your physical locations, and you've got to have a high level of curation. And if you can do those two things, not only can you get foot traffic, but you can also demonstrate a willingness to pay that allows you to survive. So suddenly now we're taking a 50-year-old institution that has literally just sold books, and we're sort of evaluating the opportunity. And we realize that actually independent bookstores do those things pretty well, right? You walk into a bookstore, the smell of books, there are authors there, like having conversations. And so we said, how can we make a 2.0 version of this? And we, I think, applied the same level of disruption that any other founder would do. There was a business school professor who I had who put it incredibly well. And he said, look, in times of disruption, founders can look back and they can take old rules and they can see how they're going to play out in the new world, or they can just write new rules, right? And so we put together a plan, and we're doing it now. And it's literally the same ones and twos, I think. Once again, I haven't started a unicorn, but that many people who have an entrepreneurial journey under a more traditional background would have. And so that's how we got here today. But the fascinating thing is it's the same journey that I think anyone else who's thinking from a startup perspective would have.
It's amazing to hear you talk about not thinking of yourself as an entrepreneur, right? Both given your background, but everything you just described in terms of how you're thinking about Tattered. And I think one of the things that I don't want to say frustrates, because it sounds like I'm upset at someone else, but I'm not. I'm sort of upset at myself and kind of our ecosystem, is that we've created this world where you don't think of yourself as an entrepreneur, right? Where the people we interviewed for the New Builders don't think of themselves as entrepreneurs. And it's so crazy to me as I think about entrepreneurship. I'm not going to do it here because it's interesting, but not interesting in this context. But we actually went through a little bit of the history of the word entrepreneur and kind of where it came from and how it started to be used. And that stuff is fascinating. I think it's fascinating to think about sort of how did it get used, and then this history that I described earlier about Ronald Reagan kind of taking it and saying, "Hey, tech entrepreneurship, let's hold on to that, and we'll use it as a way of promoting capitalism." Right? I mean, that was really what he was trying to do, and differentiating that from communism. And it's this long slope where we end up with incredible entrepreneurs not thinking of themselves as entrepreneurs. It's part of why we called the book The New Builders, because we wanted to give people agency. And we had a bunch of other titles in mind. It's the process of writing a book. Maybe we'll talk about that at the very end. But it was interesting. It was a little bit different than I thought it was going to be, but in any event, we had some other things in mind. But we ended up on this sort of New Builders idea, in part because the people that we interviewed loved it, right? I mean, they loved that sort of agency. Like, hey, I'm a new builder. Like, I got it. Like, that sounds like me. I think it's so important. Let's talk a little bit about sort of access to capital, because I think this is really important. We're going to also talk about access to mentorship, because that's also important. Let me drop a stat on everyone, a couple stats, because I think it will also be surprising. And there's lots of these in the book, so hopefully you all buy it and experience, more than what I'm just saying, and buy it at Tattered.
Independent bookstores.
Exactly. Actually, there are links to independent bookstores on the New Builders website to buy it, including Tattered. Only about 1% of businesses take money from venture capitalists. So that doesn't sound like our world, because sort of, it's Denver Startup Week. We're obviously highly represented in the startup, venture-backed startup world. But the truth is, across all businesses, 1% take money from venture capital. Only about 17% of businesses raise money from banks. So that leaves over 80% of businesses left to fend for themselves. They raise money from friends and family. They raise money from a home equity line. They raise money from, a rich aunt or a rich uncle. One of the challenges, especially as New Builders have become more diverse, is that there are huge racial wealth gaps in the United States. The average Black family has 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. The average Hispanic family has 1/7 the wealth of the average white family. Interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, that's true across educational level and true across income level. So a Black family where the head of household makes $100,000 a year, it's not 1 to 10, but it's 1 to 5, has much less wealth than the average white family where the head of household makes the same. It's the result of, in the US, at least 400 years of systemic racism and our history of slavery, right? Obviously, racism dates back past the founding of the US. But that's the result, right? And you can really see it. And that makes it a lot harder for people starting businesses today, who are more likely to be people of color and women to access the capital that they need to build their businesses. And oftentimes we're not talking about, obviously in the Tattered cover case, it was a larger amount of money, but oftentimes we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars to get a business off the ground, right? I described this woman, Danaris Mazzara, who's sort of woven throughout the book, who started her business with $37 in food stamps. That might be a little bit extreme or a lot extreme in this context, but many new builders start businesses with tens of thousands of dollars in capital. Let's talk a little bit about access to capital, how you were able to access it, the areas in which you had privilege given your background in networks, but maybe the areas where either you or other people that you know struggled, because I think that at some point, in order to scale, businesses require capital.
So this is probably the toughest problem I think that faces entrepreneurs, and I think from a macro perspective, in many ways, the ability to raise capital is part of a longer journey, right? And two things have to happen with that. On the capital raising side, or the people who are willing to distribute capital, we have to evolve how we think about returns, right? And it's something that you'll rarely hear me talk about Amazon, but this notion of a longer return horizon actually is somewhat applicable here. You know, when we went out and fundraised for the Tattered cover, we were under no illusion that this was going to be, you know, 100 million, a 500 million, $1 billion organization. But we were very, very clear that we were going to run it for profit, and we were going to provide a return for our investors. And we had incredibly, at least I thought, realistic financials, as realistic as you can be when asking for money, right? But we had a plan to accommodate that. And the plan allowed for self-sufficiency of the business, a return for the investors, and in general, just profitability. We have to start investing in companies that think like that, right? And it should be a part of a diversified portfolio, because to go to the B's point, which is a really fantastic point, the other thing that we were offering is the cultural benefit of having a strong independent bookstore, right? So my pitch was essentially, there are all these amazing institutions when you think about in the Denver metro area, you know, the DCPA, you know, the Art Museum, the zoo, the list goes on, et cetera, et cetera. I actually put independent bookstores in that category, right? And I think as we continue to see how much local businesses affect our economy, that list keeps going longer and longer and longer. And so the closest I've heard is this notion of impact investing, which I think has elements that hit on this, but there's something to thinking about. We need more of a community banking mindset that I think it's dwindled, right, over the past 50 years. And so that's on the access to capital. People really have to start saying, look, I'm not necessarily going to place 20 bets with the hope of one of them being an outstanding hit. There are ways to diversify your portfolio where you can still carry the same amount of risk and actually spread wealth to people that need to be spreading it. On the raising of money side, it's hard. It's really, really, really hard. And I'll tell you, I went to 3 Ivy League schools. I worked at Bain & Company, but like I couldn't have bought the Tattered cover, right? And I didn't have, you know, a rich uncle or aunt to just sort of write that check. I had to hustle for it, and it was incredibly hard. And the only thing I can tell you is keep going to things like this, keep educating yourself, keep networking, and really believe in yourself and be able to take no well. And at some level, I think if you have the right story, if you have the right ambition, you're going to find that capital. Particularly for businesses like ours, we raised a decent amount of money for Tattered cover, but the type of businesses that Seth's talking about, you know, you're starting to look at numbers that are in the thousands that can get you to starting something, right? And I honestly do believe if you've got grit, if you've got determination, and you've got the right story, you'll find that capital, and then the rest is really controlling your destiny. But I'm not gonna dismiss how hard it is to do it.
You teed up a couple thoughts here for me that I want to hit on. Wasn't thinking about talking about banking now, but let's talk about it because the statistics are stark. 20 years ago, there were 14,000 banks in the United States. Today, there are fewer than 4,500. Actually, in the book, we wrote 4,800 because a year and a half ago when I wrote that, it was higher. Most of that consolidation is happening at the lower end of the banking, the smaller end of the banking sector. 80% of deposits are controlled by the top 4 banks in the United States. Now, some of those banks, so JP Morgan, I think is on one of the logos behind us, are doing some really good things, trying to invest in communities beyond just sort of traditional white male founders. Which is great. We should encourage that. But the truth is that community banks, in particular CDFIs, which is sort of a special type of community bank, community finance development institution, that have a long history, but were essentially codified in '92 under an act that Bill Clinton signed, which he's talked about as one of his proudest achievements. But community banks and CDFIs do a great job of lending money to new builders, to people of color, to people in rural areas, and those are institutions that we need to find a better way to support. I've been working on some legislation with, including some of our local Congress people and senators around sort of better support for community banks. But one of the things that, when people ask me, well, hey, what can I do to support new builders? One of the things that one can do is open a savings account at a community bank. There's about a 10-to-1 ratio that of money invested in a bank, deposited in a bank, about for every dollar that gets deposited, about $10 gets lent out, because it gets lent out, then redeposited, lent out. And when you sort of do all the math all the way through, there's about a 10-to-1 leverage to that money. So if you open a $10,000 checking account or savings account at a community bank, you will help facilitate about $100,000 in loans, and those loans are much more likely to go to new builders who struggle to attract capital, including venture capital. And we can talk about maybe that as a separate thing, and our own challenges as an industry with funding diverse founders. But that's true in the banking sector as well, right? People of color and women apply for smaller loan amounts, get approved for smaller loan amounts, pay higher interest rates, and are less likely, because of those things, to apply for loans in the first place. Research that was done actually has another Colorado connection. That research was done by a Fed researcher, Kaufman Fellow, by the name of Alicia Robb in Boulder, Colorado. And so those are things that make it harder for people to attract capital, right? I mean,
super hard. And something that came to mind, the notion of a side hustle is real, right? So I was fully employed when we were going after money for Tattered cover. The number one thing, and to be clear, I don't want to rail on banks. I'm actually on the board at Citywide Bank. So I'm not anti-bank, but the figures that Seth said are true. And the number one things that banks are concerned about is their level of risk, right? And there are reasons over the past 15 years in particular why that is the case. And so the number one thing that you can do to get that support from a bank is, one, establish a local connection. And the problem is, when you have the JP Morgans, the Wells Fargos, they're just putting everything into like an algorithm that's spitting out yes or no, right? One of the great things about having community-led banks is you can actually meet bankers. You can make that sort of personal connection. So I encourage you to do that. The second thing, though, I call it, eliminating risk, right? And so it is your classic story that the idea may actually just not be enough. And honestly, that's not the worst thing, right? You may have to spend nights and weekends getting something that's viable, right? And there are two ways to look at it. You can look at it that that's incredibly annoying and that you may have peers or there are demographics that don't have to do that, and that sucks. The other way to look at it is, I don't know, I'd rather go into something 130% if I know if it's viable than just having an idea that I don't. So having something that you can actually say to a bank, to an angel, to a VC, we are doing this and we are getting that, right? It could be a very small idea. And now you're not fueling an idea, you're fueling growth. And those are the types of things that bankers, I don't want to speak for people in the venture community, it's easier for them to get behind, particularly if you come from a background that they're not used to funding.
Yeah, the community banking angle was really interesting. I didn't know a lot about community banks when I started writing the book, and Elizabeth and I didn't go looking for the community bank story. It came to us. It just turned out I think because of the way that community banks operate and frankly, the role that they play in our economy, it turned out that most, maybe all of the 16 or so new builders that we highlighted in the book, and there were probably another, I don't know, 10 or so that we had talked to and didn't end up, their stories didn't end up making it as part of the final, the final book. Almost all of them ended up with some sort of community bank story, right? There was some, and a couple of them switched from a larger bank for the reasons that you're describing, Kwame, the way they just felt like they had that better connection. Phil Knight talks about this in his book Shoe Dog, right? He wanted to be able to walk across the street and see his banker, and know that banker, right? And so, that was an interesting part of the story. Before we switch off of capital, I want to just leave you all with something that that Nikisha Booth said to me a number of months ago. Which really stuck with me, which is that, when you give someone a small amount of money, you're forcing them to think small. When you give someone a larger amount of money, you allow them to open their mind to thinking bigger. And I think that's something that we don't always appreciate. And I think part of the narrative that's absolute bullshit in my mind is this notion of like, well, if people of color were better entrepreneurs, why aren't there more businesses that are huge businesses that were founded by people of color? One, that's not totally true. And two, it's bullshit because we don't provide anywhere close to the resources that are available to the typical white male founder to this more diverse group. And so it's not fair to judge them by the same lens. And I think that that's really kind of frustrating. And it stuck with me. One of the a woman that I spoke to as part of the research for the book said to me, this was kind of right as we did the research pre-COVID, and then we started writing the book during COVID. COVID actually was really helpful because we wrote the book in like 5 months, because it was like, oh crap, we need to get this out right away, because of course COVID was disproportionately hurting businesses started by people of color and women. Anyway, so we were calling back up some of the people we had talked to, and I was speaking to Catherine Finney, who started a bunch of different businesses and eventually started Digital Undivided, which is a support network and incubator accelerator for Black and Latina women. And she said to me, I was asking her, hey, like, how do you think the people that you work with are going to do through COVID? And she said, they're going to be just fine. Right? Black women have spent 400 years being under-resourced. Like, this is not, this is nothing new. Like, we're going to figure it out. And she said it in a sort of flippant way, but those sorts of things really stuck with me because it's not a joke, right? It's reflective of a history that is a troubling and embarrassing history, but also reflective of the burden that we put on many people who are starting businesses today. And anyway, just share that because I think both what Catherine said as well as before what Nikisha said are really important. I want to touch on something because I think you said something that really stuck with me, and it is something that I think is really important. It's not just new builders that are building these local businesses that have these local connections, but we talk a lot about this in the book. The community fabric, right? The place in community that people that are building a business have, the support that they give to each other. And I think it's really important. And I think it's something that we sort of miss, right? I mean, and I understand the value of an Amazon, let's say, right? And there's people who live in hard to reach places that can now order the same things that we can all order. And that's really important. And I occasionally drink a Starbucks. It's not that big chains are inherently bad, but there's sort of a balance, and we've become very out of balance. There's a bunch of stats on that in the book if people are interested to go deeper in it, but there are far more chain stores than there used to be, meaning locations. And that's taking something away. I'd love to hear a little bit more about both specifically what some of the events that Tattered is supporting, how you draw people in, how you think about your place in community. Tattered is unique in the sense that you don't have just one location, you have a number of locations, but then also just your thoughts more generally expanding on that topic of why these local businesses, call them grassroots entrepreneurs, right? Why they're so important to local communities.
I mean, I think it's as simple as they understand better what a community needs. I mean, you can just imagine just the pragmatic element of if you are headquartered in San Francisco, right, and you're trying to provide intimate services for Colorado, well, obviously you're going to have people on the ground in Colorado and they're going to be employed, but how much autonomy does that group have to actually implement those changes? Probably a fair amount. To answer your question, Seth, the thing I'm actually becoming most proud of is our role in helping like local artists like get their due, right? Because we are able to accept books and even art, and we're going to start doing musical performances of people who are just in Colorado, and we can build a model where we're selling things that are just being sold in Colorado, and we want to be the birthplace of things that actually get incredibly popular. It's not totally apropos, but a really cool example is 5280, the magazine here. That was essentially the first channel for 5280 was Tattered cover. And essentially the magazine was in the stores and people kept browsing and reading and buying, and they realized that they had something. It's kind of the community banking model, right? Where you are giving people the opportunity to put their product in your store because you can know them intimately, you can make risk, and there's way less bureaucracy associated with it, right? The other thing that I think, you get is you just get members in the community, right? And I think Denver already does a very good job with this, and it's something we don't want to lose. We're just more accessible, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like, think of the highest person at Amazon that you can reasonably speak with, right? I mean, and within a local economy, you can honestly like text me tonight and like we can do coffee tomorrow. I don't have anything else to do, right? And so that intimacy and just having that physical presence is so helpful, right? And typically if you are running sort of a local business, you care about the area that you're in, right? And so you're not just running the local business, you're involved in initiatives, you're trying to help people out, you're networking, you're connecting. All of these things really create an ecosystem. And I can't, the bees example is so great because if you go to the Botanic Gardens, right, I just was floored at how important bees are. I've always been like so annoyed with them, right? Because I'm always fearful of getting stung and they're just there. But it's the same with local businesses. You can see areas and cities where local businesses have been decimated and they are fundamentally different. And what's so fascinating to me, and you're seeing this now, is there's a push for places like Santa Fe. And there was a push 10 years ago or 15 years ago for places like Austin. There's a push for places like Denver. And people are like, well, why? What's going on? We haven't been consumed by major corporations. And I think that's just another way of saying we still have an authenticity of who we are. And that authenticity is maintained because we have this local flair of local businesses who understand our consumers and want to help out the community.
We actually talk in the book about a couple of communities that went even a step further, right? I mean, and they actually legislated that chain stores couldn't be in their downtown area, right? It was Port Washington was one of the first ones, but Nantucket we talk about. We sort of write a little vignette, actually talk about the local bookstore in Nantucket, Nantucket Bookworks, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. But we do ask the question. I mean, these are all those are pretty affluent communities.
Pretty
right?
affluent communities.
So, is that just the purview of rich places where they can say, hey, and the Nantucket story is funny because it was a Ralph Lauren that opened up in Nantucket and people were like, oh my God, chain stores have come to Nantucket. I can't believe there's a Ralph Lauren. And so that was when they decided that, this is maybe 15 years ago, decided to legislate that there couldn't be chain stores, which they defined as stores that have more than 15 locations that share a similar look and feel.
Yeah. So just to be clear, and I think most, well, I'm not going to speak for other local business people. I am not anti big business. I go to Starbucks all the time. Dunkin' Donuts, like,
Delish. Yeah.
delish. I mean, it's it's incredibly great business model. I think the only time you start, well, I think there are two things. I think one, communities have to decide if they want local, and a community can just as easily decide they don't want local. I mean, I would argue maybe San Francisco could be an example of they were like, we're looking at the other side of it, and this is good for us. So it's not to say that the big businesses are bad. I think the problem that we run into, I think, are twofold. One is something that Seth and Elizabeth have done such a good job of unearthing, is there's a stigma against doing what I do that is not as cool as working for an HR SaaS organization. And that's just the reality. The second thing is, sometimes companies will do things that you could argue are a little bit predatory, right? And maybe you could argue that that's, helping the consumer, but it's really actually like hurting local businesses, which is the equivalent of like killing your bees. And that's frustrating. And in those situations, we feel utterly defenseless. And that's not right either. And so if we can have, and I think this is, I'll tell you, as a minority, I feel the exact same way with every element of my life. If I can just have an equal playing field, I'm totally happy. I don't want to cancel out any form of competition. I just want the equal playing field. And if you've got, let's say like a business that allows you to fund other elements of your business, and that sort of feels unequal and sort of monopolistic, that's tough. So just my only point, local doesn't mean anti-corporate. In fact, we need to operate together to have a full ecosystem.
Absolutely. And we talk about this a lot in the book, right? The question is balance. And it's not there. It's certainly in my view, and what we describe in the New Builders is not an anti-big business message at all. It's a message of balance, and we need a little bit of balance. Sometimes you want to be able to order from Amazon. Sometimes you want to be able to go down to a local shop. But I can't emphasize enough that we make choices every day as consumers and otherwise as investors potentially, et cetera, about what's important. And COVID, I think, has been a really good opportunity to kind of reevaluate that a little bit. And those choices matter. And I'll give a call out to my wife, who's doing some really interesting work. We live in Longmont, actually, which is north of Denver a little ways, near Boulder, but not Boulder.
Not Boulder.
Not Boulder, yeah. Sorry for the Boulder people out there. I was telling Kwame, I saw this great sticker. My wife and I she has an office at a co-working spot in downtown Longmont. And we went to move some furniture last night. And then we went next door to grab a bite to eat before we went back home. And there was a sticker at this restaurant that said, "Don't Boulder my Longmont," which I thought was really funny, along with a whole bunch of loco stickers, which is Longmont, Colorado, like slightly crazy. But in any event, she has bought and renovated a bunch of buildings on Main Street with the expressed desire, and now is renting them out slightly below market, but to actual local businesses, right? It was important to her to make that investment. You mentioned this, and it actually popped in my head when you said it, but thinking long term. It's not that it's not making money. She makes money doing that. Yeah. And in her mind, and I think this is true, it'll appreciate more if the Main Street stays vibrant. So today she could make more money by renting a space to a chain store or a bank, but she's decided that the long-term health of the downtown corridor is more important. And fortunately, I mean, she has the means to do this, and so the cap rate doesn't need to be crazy high in the first years, but it'll over time appreciate. And she owns a decent amount of real estate, so it's actually impactful.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
How do we align incentives and get people to realize what your wife just realized? Because you nailed it, right? By having a vibrant local community, the appreciation of her asset, which is all that matters in that type of a play, is going to be outsized.
Yeah. So the answer is bees. We actually talk about this a little bit in the book. There is this notion of the tragedy of commons, right? Which describes the behavior of businesses, and it suggests that sort of left to their own devices, businesses will do crappy things, right? They will pollute streams, they will not treat their workers well, et cetera. That's generally speaking true, but there's some really interesting research that's been done that businesses that are in a much tighter community don't behave that way. They don't need the regulatory frameworks that larger businesses require to hold them in line, because they are more community minded. And so ultimately the answer is for people to be more in community, right? My wife feels very strongly about Longmont as a community. We do. It's the both of us. It's her business, but we both feel that way. And she made a decision. This is how I want to operate because of that sense of place and community. I don't know how I'm going to use the term that I want to be cautious about. I don't know how we scale that, meaning I don't know how we get more and more people to think that way, but I think that we're back to being bees. Like if we can understand that the survival of our hive is really reliant on everyone then I think more people will think that way. And by the way, I think in Colorado, we are uniquely positioned to do that. When I think about the history of Denver and Boulder and all of the work that's been done in tech and outside, again, Give First and all of the things we talk about when we get to events like this, I think we are in a great position as a community to come together and actually do some of these things.
It's true. And so we talked about this very quickly yesterday, and I don't want to go into the politics of this organization, just the model that they created. Do we need a TFA for local businesses where people go into leading a business and it's not for eternity? I think one of the bigger stigmas, or the reasons why that the stigma exists.
Teach for America, just making sure people.
Oh yeah, Teach for America.
A Service Corps kind of.
No fair. Sorry. I think one of the bigger stigmas is that there's an implicit assumption. Okay, you purchase the Tattered cover, you're running the Tattered cover. That's what you're gonna do for the rest of your life, right? And I'm not sure that exists in the same way if you're building a startup, right? Or building a more tech-based startup, right? There's sort of your 10-year plan, right, to grow and like exit. And I think because it's unlikely that we will have that type of an exit, people don't put you on that same type of timeline. And then subsequently, they assume you're going to be doing it into perpetuity. What I would argue is the experience you get running a local business, even if it's not something that you're planning to do for the rest of your life, that type of learning and education is so unique, and it's going to prepare you to do whatever you want afterwards, right? So how do we get to more Bs? Well, I think we probably get more people running these local types of businesses, and we actually have to find ways to incentivize them. We have to find ways to train them. We have to find ways for them to acquire those businesses, because I got to be honest with you, by definition, if something is local, it's kind of being disrupted right now. And I don't use disruption positively. Like, there's a terrorizing going on with that. And we need people to come in, evolve, grow, reimagine, but stabilize. And so my pitch to everyone is come and join the party, right? And if you look at it from a perspective, like, I'm doing this for 2 to 5 years, I don't know. It's sort of like your wife's play with property. If you do this for 2 to 5 years, even from a financial perspective, if you think what you can do afterwards, it might be a better angle. I don't know.
Yeah, think big, right?
I think so.
Let's talk about. So we talked about capital. I want to talk about access to help and mentorship, because one of the things that was really, it just stood out to me through the research that we did. There's some great organizations that are helping new builder businesses access capital. And these are community loan funds and the like. There's a couple of venture funds that have used some slightly different models that aren't sort of venture, sort of unicorn hunting models. But all of the most successful ones, at least that we found, pair money with what's called technical assistance in that world, but with advice and mentorship. And in the tech world, of course, that's something that we think about all the time, right? I mean, that's, part of my pitch as a VC is like, hey, I'm not like the other 1,000 VCs. I can help whatever. And I mean, I'm earnest when I say that, but the truth is that there is a lot of support for technology businesses, whether it's from people like me or from Techstars or other organizations. We don't really have that same model for new builder businesses, certainly at that scale, and we don't think about it. And that's why Digital Undivided and SistaBiz and some of the other Camelback Ventures, some of the other groups that we talk about in the book are so important. Talk a little bit about sort of access to something beyond just capital in Tattered or in other experiences for you.
So there's the Tattered explanation, in which we've been incredibly lucky because we have access to very smart people who can give us advice. And I can tell you, mentorship matters. The ability to call someone who you trust and to just cut the BS and say, this is what's going on, I need your advice, and to have them do advice that is solely for your benefit, that makes you a better leader. It's something, if you don't have, it's very hard to get. I think if you're not thinking through those like formal organizations, my answer is everyone actually possesses the ability to be a mentor. And we have to hit a pay it forward model, right? Where you are thinking about 2 to 3 people who are a step behind where you are and giving them the advice and knowledge and awareness that you have. And you're doing that. And the way that you do that, once again, it's really through persistence. Yeah, I can tell you, and now I'm starting to feel old, but like I'm sort of in that situation where like I've got people who I think want me to be their mentor, and I want to be their mentor, but it's probably not, unfortunately, like the top 6 things I'm thinking about in a given day, right? And so the requirement of those potential mentees, they got to reach out. And it's like any type of friendship or dating or whatever, you'll know if there's a connection. And if there's not, move on and keep looking, right? And if there is, milk it for every single thing you can. Because honestly, from a mentor perspective, there's actually few greater joys than helping someone and being able to say to someone, hey, this is what I did. I wish I would have done it a little bit differently. Let me tell you why, and hopefully have a more positive outcome from where they stand. And so once again, it's networky. There's not a sort of do this answer other than it's persistence, and it's really trying to connect with people who work with you. And the one thing that I always encourage people to do is step outside of your comfort zone, right? There are a lot of old white males right now who got nothing to do, and they've got so much experience. I'm serious about this. And most want to mentor, and go after them. Seriously, talk to them, find them, reach out, ask questions, get their experience, and honestly get their perspective. I actually love it, right? CEO of Macmillan Publishing is on our board of directors, and he's not only like a mentor, he's a friend, but he just has seen everything, and the ability to have that in my life is so special. And what I find is people will say, hey, I'm a Black male in America, I got to find a Black male mentor. I'm not saying that's not the case. But I am saying if you go to the numbers, it's a tougher game. And so if you live in a world in which it's incredibly informal, how you're thinking through this stuff, run towards the numbers, find people you connect with, and like leverage them for everything you can.
Let me talk to the old white guys.
You're not that old.
As one myself.
No.
One of the things that is a challenge is that statistically speaking, people end up preferring to mentor people that look more like them, right? And this is one of the reasons that women have struggled in corporate America. This is one of the reasons why. And the solution, to your point, is not, well, women should mentor more women. I mean, yes, that's fine, but we need to kind of step out of that. And I guess I've thought about this a lot because I've spent the last 2 years now. I mean, I've lived a very comfortable, business life, right? Most of the people I talk to want something or, are interested in my opinion about things. And many of them look a lot like me. And I'm rarely in situations where I'm uncomfortable. And I've spent the last 2 years in lots of rooms where I was the minority, not the majority, and lots of conversations where, I fucked up and said not quite the right thing and had to be corrected and, really get out of my comfort zone. And I think one of the things that I talk about, especially when I'm in groups of, older white guys like me, is like, you got to get okay with that. Maybe not comfortable with that, but okay with that. Because there is a certain amount of putting yourself out there. But, when I think about, when I hear VCs talk about the pipeline problem and stuff like that, I think that's bullshit. They have a network problem. There's not a pipeline problem. They have a network problem. And having now spent several years really actively trying to change that for myself, I can say that if you are willing to work on it, you can network with all sorts of different people with lots of different backgrounds, right? And I think that's been eye-opening is probably the right word for me, but I want to both acknowledge but also challenge the people that are listening, that it's okay to be a little bit uncomfortable and to be in conversation where you could be a little bit uncomfortable. And many of the best discussions I've had over the last couple years as I've been working very intently on this work have been in situations where I was a little bit out of my comfort zone and I wasn't always sure of the thing to say, and occasionally got corrected about something, and it's okay, right? It's like you
totally okay.
You figure it out and then you move on.
But to me, and so I, very obsessed with politics, right? But there's something about business that politics has lost, and it's a common denominator of money. And at the end of the day, that's all we're trying to do here, right? And so I think if you share an interest, if you share a passion, particularly around the business subject, both sides can connect. And you can figure out about, like, culturally, if you're going to golf or whatever you're going to do, you can push that aside and you can just connect on the business at hand. And to me, business has such a unique opportunity to do that. It was so fascinating for me. I basically throughout college, go to law school, everything sort of thinking politically, Democrat, Republican, blah, 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 blah. And I hit management consulting and did not matter, could not care who you were supporting, what you're doing, what your thoughts were. Because if we were on a case, that was the objective, right? And let's use that as something that brings us together and puts everything else aside. And so I totally applaud everything that you're doing. And I look at it from my side, where I'm going to assume that you don't have to do as much as you're doing for me to reach out. And really, it does go back to dating, because sometimes people don't want to talk to you, right? And if we've learned anything in the past 5 years, okay, so don't talk to them, right? Leave them alone. But I think you will. I think if your passion is contagious, if what you're trying to do is reasonable and sound, leverage LinkedIn. Go to things like Denver Startup Week, connect with people, and use that mentorship, because that mentorship isn't just business advice. It's connections to other important people. It's a willingness to invest in you as a person. It's absolutely essential to business success.
There's so much power also in opening up your own network, right? And allowing other people sort of access, right? I mean, we talked about, one of the challenges is access, and being supportive, and that there are tangible things that everyone listening to this call can do. And I like what you said, because I totally believe it, which is that everyone has something to add to another business. The last chapter of the book, if you're interested, we talk about more things, but chapter 16 is all about, which actually was the last chapter we wrote. It turns out, I didn't realize this, you don't write a book from chapter 1 through chapter 16. You might be I think I started with chapter 6, which is the history chapter, and then Elizabeth maybe wrote chapter 1, and then I wrote chapter 8, and then you go back to chapter 2. And anyway, but we actually did write chapter 16 at the very end, and we talk about some things that people can do as individuals to support new builders, and I won't repeat them all here, but a lot of them have to do with making deliberate decisions, putting yourself out there, and making the decision to do good, right? I mean, to be change. And I think that's really a really important message to leave people with. We've got just a couple minutes left. I haven't asked you about any mistakes. I rarely get an entrepreneur on stage like this without asking that question, but because I think it's important for people to understand that I wasn't thinking about this in the setup of the question. We have a whole chapter on failure, that mistakes happen, right? And that we can learn from that. And I think one of the challenges for new builders is the consequences of failure are higher than they are for the rest of us. Which is something we need to change. But I'd love to hear maybe a couple of blunders that you made in the Tattered context or something else, because I think it's helpful. Humility.
Oh my God!
Turns you into even more of a human.
So macro point, and I really, really believe this, that the definition of strong leadership is the understanding that you are going to make a lot of mistakes, and to not let any one mistake overwhelm you, because they're all going to happen. They're going to be different. And that's just what it is to be a leader. Right. And I actually, maybe it's because I make a lot of mistakes. I very quickly adopt at this point. I mean, I'll give you the biggest one, right? So, Tattered cover is, I think we're technically the 4th, maybe 3rd now largest independent bookstore in the country. Right. And so, you see Kwame Spearman, CEO, co-owner, and we are talking to a reporter, and the reporter's like, "Oh, so I think this makes it the largest Black-owned bookstore, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, why not, right? I'm the guys running the store, and largest shareholder, yeah, sure, why not, right?" Well, a statement like that in December 2020, particularly after the past few months the Tattered cover had, is going to generate a lot of interest. And suddenly now, we've got NPR running a story that says, Tattered cover now largest Black-owned bookstore. The mistake was that there's a nuance about what that means that we didn't talk about, right? Tattered cover, you walk in, it is an independent bookstore. We obviously are like working painfully hard on DEI, but we are not just a Black like bookstore, right? Like there are going to be tons of titles, right? And suddenly now there's an even bigger kerfuffle going on about what it means to be a Black-owned bookstore. The Denver Post sends out a push notification. So the Denver Post push notification wasn't about, isn't it great what's happening with the tattered cover? It was like us being embroiled in racial controversy, and people I didn't know were like calling me out and being like, it was crazy. It was literally crazy. And it's one of those mistakes where you go at it from a notion of like empowerment. Isn't this going to be great? Aren't people going to be happy? And it just totally boiled over. And the reality of the situation was, like all things, you stick to your guns. If you're operating with positive intent, like you'll survive it. But I think that, and I totally agree with Seth's point, the issue is that in so many scenarios, if you are a new builder and you make a mistake, it actually is it. And we've got to change that. And the way that you change it, I think, I feel so fortunate because we've got a board, employees, people who helped fund us. And I just feel incredibly supported to make those types of blunders because I think people trust me. And I am the first to tell you it's an incredibly privileged situation. And it's one that new builders have to strive to get into. At the same time, for those who are the funders, you got to embrace the fact that everyone's going to make a mistake. And depending on what someone looks like, it's still just a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for being open to sharing that.
It's all Googleable, so
yeah.
it's one of those things where
No, exactly. Listen, this has been fantastic. Kwame, I want to thank you for this conversation and your support of the new builders and our work. I want to thank the people that are here in person. It's awesome to have people actually at live, not just boxes on the screen. And of course, want to thank everyone who's listening in really across Colorado. Enjoy the rest of Denver Startup Week, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you very much.